the Gritty Side of Grace podcast. I'm Carolyn, your host, therapist, and thanatologist. So today we have a really great, experienced, seasoned clinical psychologist with us, Barry J. Jacobs. So thank you. I'm super excited.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, seasoned is the right word, like many seasons. But I always appreciate being held up as an elder. That's great.
It's good. It's a good thing. It's good.
Yeah, yes, it is. I'm happy for the experience.
Look, after reading your book, it's really, that the experience and the wisdom is really what we're going to talk about today, right?
Great.
So I want to introduce you and read your bio here. Okay. So Barry J. Jacobs is a Philadelphia area clinical psychologist, family therapist. I'm a therapist, I should be able to say that, and healthcare consultant, a former journalist, very cool. He is an author or co-author of three self-help books for caregivers. So being a writer probably helped with that, which is great. And including the AARP Caregiver Answer Book, which we're going to talk about. And that was just published this past July by Guilford Press, which is great. Since 2013, he has written a self-help column for caregivers for the AARP website. That is very cool. He is also a board member of the Caregiver Action Network, one of the country's premier caregiver support and advocacy organizations, which is really important, the advocacy piece, right? For 7 years, he was primary caregiver for his mother with vascular dementia and stepfather with Alzheimer's. And I love that you share a lot of these personal stories also in here. So thank you.
Yeah, it makes it much more real. It makes it much more relatable. I mean, actually, if I don't have personal experience, no, or I don't share my personal experience, no one will put much stock in what I have to say as a psychologist. They want to know that you've walked the walk, not just talked the talk.
Yeah, and a couple, when I was reading this, there's a couple stories I'd love for you to share, and some of them I may ask you to share that I thought were really great. So I do want to say, as you can see, I want you to, I loved your book. I highlight, look, this page has a lot of highlights. One of the pages I went crazy on. We're gonna see Carolyn. I just did a lot of highlighting and see, look at, I don't know if you can see stars and highlighting. So there's a lot of information in this book. We're not, of course, going to get to all of it. We're going to talk, and then some stuff I want to let our listeners know, our watchers know, there's so much information in here. So I love how also one thing that you really made it into these sections, chapters, but they're really helpful. So I do want to kind of go through them in the, like, one of the things I like to talk about is structure and how we define things. I think in caregiving, I think in therapy in general, and certainly when I worked at end of life, everything's like, ugh. How can we help people have some structure? How can we kind of parse it out, which you do really well. So I want to kind of stay with your structure if that's okay.
Sounds good.
So you began with Welcome to Caregiving. I love that. That's really nice. So I learned something new right off the bat. You use the term care receiver. I hadn't heard that before.
Yeah, so the care receiver is defined as just a person who has the illness or has functional deficits due to age, and they're the person receiving the care. And there's a lot of different terms used for the person who does the care. So it's caregiver or care partner, or in Europe and most of the rest of the world, carer. But generally speaking, most people will use care receiver as just the object of care. And it's not an easy thing to be a care receiver, as we may discuss. Most people would much rather give than receive, because to be on the receiving end of care often feels disempowering and sometimes shaming for some folks. It's really tough.
hmm Yeah, we'll talk about dignity. And yeah, there's a lot there, and you give a lot of great kind of case studies, and I'm going to go into those. You do a little bit of a detail of a job description for caregivers, which I think is so helpful. Can you give us a little bit more about the job description part?
Sure. And the reason my wife, Julia Mayer, who co-wrote the book, and I spend time on this. Thank you. There she is. The reason we talk about a job description is because when someone has a parent or a spouse and they suddenly have a disability, or even if it's not sudden, they have a condition that's progressed to the point that they now need help. Most folks really are a little bit in the dark about what they're supposed to do. They know they're supposed to do something, and maybe they've learned a few things about what needs to get done over time. Maybe they are now doing things like driving for someone at night because they don't feel that person doesn't feel safe driving any longer at night, or they need help with their finances because they can't really manage their checkbook anymore. So little by little, people begin accruing tasks that they're doing for somebody else. But it's also nice in going into this to really have an idea of all the different things that you may be expected to do, and there are many. So you're a companion, you're a coach, you're a driver, you're what I call a technical interpreter. You go to the doctor's office and you listen to what the doctor says, and then you have to understand what the doctor's saying, and then explain it to the rest of the family. Sometimes afterwards, you have to explain it to the care receiver because the care receiver may not understand it all. At the same time, you want to explain a little bit about who the care receiver is and the care receiver's environment and circumstances, so the doctor has a better idea of who this person is. That they're not just a disease, but they're a person. And so there's a lot of kind of being the middleman between the medical system and the family system that the caregiver has to negotiate. And then, the caregivers also do a lot of healthcare. They manage medication boxes. They sometimes flush feeding tubes, or they run lines. They do things that maybe in their wildest dreams they never thought they were going to do. But if their care receiver needs that care in the home and they're the person living with them, then yes, indeed, they're going to have to learn those skills and get comfortable with them. And so people wind up taking on tasks and learning skills they had never imagined they would ever in their lifetime do something like this.
Yeah, yeah. And when I worked in hospice, that certainly came up a lot. But I think it's really important. I like these job descriptions because I think as these roles start to either change or even come up, you had a long relationship with your mom or your partner, and your role is becoming something different. And I think I'm in Brooklyn. I don't know if you can all hear the Atlantic Avenue. Hello. But these roles, as things change, I think it can be helpful to help people define what they're doing and what these changes are. So I love that you really wrote it out like that.
Yeah, no, again, to your point about structure, I think when people have structure, or what I think about it as a roadmap, they may not know all the things they're going to see along this journey, but with a map, they at least have some better idea of where they're going and what the options are, and it takes away some of the uncertainty. Because without structure, without a roadmap, then people are often they're just kind of lost. They're wandering around, and when they're wandering around, they're very anxious. So the structure, the roadmap decreases anxiety, which is what we want. This is a anxiety producing enough job. We want to make it as easy as possible for people to feel like they can do a good job. Nobody wants to do a bad job at this. And so the idea is we want to give them the tools and the structure and the knowledge so that they could do a good job.
I'm gonna just wait a moment. Can you hear all these sirens? Uh,
Nope.
Okay, then we don't need to wait. And you do go more into that, and I want to go into, well, maybe we jump into that. Did you want to, you talked about the three factors for caregivers to assess if they can do it. The ability, I love that. Ability, availability, willingness. Will you go into that a bit?
Yeah. So lots of times caregivers will say, "I'll do whatever it takes to care for a care receiver," and that sounds good, right? And it sounds noble, but it's not realistic oftentimes because it's not like we have an infinite amount of time and an infinite amount of skill that we can just be there for someone and do everything that needs to get done. And so realistically assessing what one can do, there are those three factors. The first, availability. How many hours a day, how many hours a week, or how many hours a year can you really be there with a care receiver when you may have a job, or when you may have other family responsibilities, or maybe you live 500 miles away.
Mhm.
So availability is almost always necessarily limited. we all have our strengths and weaknesses. We all have, and that our weaknesses will limit our abilities. Maybe we're not strong enough to pick up someone who's fallen on the ground. Maybe we are not, have enough. We don't have enough financial acumen to manage the finances or to deal with the insurance forms. Or maybe we don't really understand enough about the medical terminology to be able to communicate effectively with the healthcare team. So we have to take into account what we're good at and what we're not good at, and that will also limit what we do or help define what we do and what we don't do. And then the last one, which is really most important, is willingness. And willingness is really based on what is a historical relationship we've had with a care receiver. If they've been, say, a very good parent to us and we want to give back to them, then we may be very willing to do whatever we can to help them. If they've been a bad parent, meaning a parent who was neglectful or even abusive, maybe we're not so willing to sacrifice our time and energy to help them at this point in their lives. Or there are other factors that come into willingness. Again, many folks have multiple family responsibilities. They may have a parent who needs help or a spouse who needs help, or they have children that they have to care for. They have other commitments that they've made. All of those things have to be taken into account. So when people weigh availability, ability, and willingness, they begin to get an idea of what they realistically can and will do. And if that isn't enough to meet the care receiver's needs, then their responsibility at that point is to figure out, okay, if I'm not going to do all of this, then how is all of this going to get done? Who am I going to hire? Who am I going to recruit from the family or from the neighborhood to help with things? How am I going to put together a caregiving plan with maybe a number of different caregiving team members to all work towards supporting the care receiver?
Mhm. Yeah, I love that. And I love that you're really trying to help people prepare for can I do this? You also talk about sustainability, which I think is really important. When I worked in hospice, we did have some people who had cared for someone for a very long time. In my experience, it tended to be dementia. And that it just was a very, very, and as you kind of said, it started as one thing, then became another. The job description changed, and I think that's what you mean by sustainability of like a long-term period of caregiving. Is that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because no one goes into this thinking, well, I'll do it for a couple of years and then I'll just stop, right? And, well, so maybe sometimes it happens if there's someone else who's like willing to take the baton from you. But if not, it's not like, well, I did it for a while. I'm kind of tired of doing it. I'm gonna, put my loved one in a nursing home. That's not usually the attitude people go in with. So, especially with a disease like dementia, which is usually a very long, slowly progressive disease, we're talking from the time someone is diagnosed with dementia, they typically live another 7 to 8 years on average. And that's a long haul to be providing care for a care receiver with dementia. And so we always liken caregiving to running a marathon. And it's a cliche that everyone has heard before. But we kind of stretch this cliche just as far as we can. And looking over your shoulder at Brooklyn, again, makes me think of the New York City Marathon. But you got all those folks out there, and who's going to make it from beginning to end? Well, the folks that have, first of all, prepared themselves as well as possible. And part of that is learning a little bit about what the course is. And so when people, New York City Marathon runners are going to look at the map, they're going to figure out where they're going. They're going to figure out where the uphills are, where the downhills are, where the water stations are. And the analogy, how that is analogous to caregiving, is caregivers need to learn about their care receiver's condition, what the treatments are, what the side effects of those treatments, what the prognosis is, and all those things will kind of give them the course, the roadmap ahead of them to get an idea of where the tough parts may be. With dementia, we know it's easiest in the beginning, and over time, it usually gets harder and harder. Um, with something like a stroke, it's usually hardest in the beginning, and then as somebody recovers, it could actually get easier. So
Mhm.
very different trajectories for different diseases, and that's part of preparing yourself. We know marathoners do better when they take in sustenance along the way. They run past the water station, and people are waving water bottles at them, and they grab two, right? And they drink one, and they douse themselves with another as a hot day, and that's how they sustain themselves over the course of the race. And analogous to the analogy with caregivers is they need to use any and all help that's available to them and not run past the water station and say, no, thank you, I'm not thirsty, which many caregivers will refuse help because they unfortunately feel that receiving help is shameful. It means that somehow they can't do it all themselves. Therefore, others have to help them, and they feel that maybe they're not being a good enough family member by receiving help. But you don't get from beginning to end and sustain yourself over that course unless you are using every available resource to replenish yourself. And then finally, people need, the marathoners have to pace themselves. If they go out too fast, then they're going to get what we used to call when I was a marathoner, a cross country runner many years ago, they used to get rigor mortis. You would go along, go as long as you could, maybe too fast, and then you would start getting really bad stomach and leg cramps, and you would have to stop. And we don't want that. We don't want caregivers to kind of go at this expending so much energy early on, because they haven't really adopted a sustainable pace, and then just becoming so depleted that they can't go on anymore and they have to quit. Because when caregivers quit, that's when care receivers wind up in institutional settings. And most care receivers don't want to go to a nursing home. They want to remain at home for as long as they can.
Yeah, yeah. No, I love that. I love your metaphor with running. Jumping ahead, I know I made a note that you had, so what you do in this book is wonderful. You have quotes from real people, what they say, and then you address them, which I love. I think that's great. And you had someone who talked to you who said, my doctor, it was a caregiver who said, my doctor thinks I'm doing too much for my wife. I think she had Parkinson's. And I'm going to jump in. When I was shadowing in hospice, I was still shadowing. I had just started, but I hadn't had my own caseload. We were working with the woman. The wife was on hospice, and I was shadowing. I didn't even know the case that well. I went one time with the nurse and I was learning. They had a son who was, I don't know, 25, 28 at the time. The caregiver, all of a sudden we were sitting in our team meeting. The caregiver died of a heart attack.
Oh my Lord.
And this poor kid, he was like 28 years, the son was like 28 years old. His dad died while mom was on hospice. I mean, it was shocking. And I do wonder, and he was older. I think he had been taking care of her. And anyway, that's an extreme. Of course, I'm sharing a very extreme situation. But we all know caregivers need to take care of themselves. And again, they were older. But not only it was so sad, and then of course my heart went out to I think they had their son late in life. So anyway, I just wanted to share that.
Well, and that's an awful story, but it's not, I mean, especially dying in the middle of a meeting. But I've heard during my 30 plus year career that I've heard of many caregivers who died before their care receivers,
Mm.
including in my own family. So my wife's father um, had multiple strokes and he had vascular dementia. And his wife, who had been an attorney, quit her job in order to take care of him, and for years really was very devoted to him. But in so doing, also neglected her own health. So she had, significant heart problems and was told she needed heart surgery. And when someone has heart surgery or any major surgery, they're basically going to be recuperating for weeks afterwards. Well, she didn't feel like she could do that and continue to take care of her husband. So she put off her heart surgery, put it off, put it off, put it off until she was essentially told, you need to have the heart surgery or you're going to die within the next few months. And then she went forward and had the heart surgery, and then unfortunately died a couple of days afterwards because of complications from the surgery. And I mean, to my mind, if she had, I mean, it was terrible because then my wife and her siblings had to step up and take care of their father. But, and at the same time, they were grieving their mother. But their mother put herself at risk for a bad outcome from her surgery by delaying as long as she did. So caregivers run risk like that when they don't take care of their heart, or don't take care of their diabetes, or they don't take care of their high blood pressure. And there been a bunch of studies over the years. One of the most famous ones of caregivers, spousal caregivers of older adults who had dementia, and found that those caregivers tended to neglected their health needs, and they died at a 63% higher rate than non-caregiving uh,
Spouse.
peers who had the same diseases but weren't caregivers. So caregivers, if they don't take care of themselves, they don't sustain themselves as caregivers, and they may not sustain themselves as people either. So that all that taking in that sustenance is so important, and just doing being smart about this, being prudent about this is essential.
Hmm. I think it's it is the cliche, but I use it with the airplane. You have to put your mask on first, right? Before you.
Yeah, but nobody does, right? No one's going to. I mean, I know that cliche, and I certainly have used it at times, but people don't think that way. People think, well, if I made the commitment to doing this and he's in so much worse shape than I am, then I got to take care of him first. The idea here is not just to put the mask on first, but let's put it on sometime, right? You can't suffocate yourself. You got to put the mask on at some point, even if you've given the care receiver the mask first.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So one thing you do really well in this book, in that's chapter of assessing your situation, and we don't have to talk about too much, but I just want to let people know where to find caregiver education and training. So there's just a lot of resources in this book. So I just think that's great. Within a lot of the chapters, you've got resources and things like that. So I just wanted to point that out. I thought that was really great. Yeah. That's great. You do talk about the overlap between social and emotional support. And you said the family and friends who pick up the meds are often the same folks who take caregivers out to lunch. I liked that. I don't know. Any other thoughts about that? Or I just thought that was really interesting.
So, so who is first of all, how are caregivers affected emotionally by caregiving? And the short answer is the majority of them are stressed. Many of them are highly stressed, um, and but most of them manage, like they get through it, and afterwards they're able to look back on it and say, "This was really really tough, but I got through it, and I'm glad I did it." Um, there are some people, particularly the ones who are highly stressed, who have higher rates of depression and anxiety as well as physical health problems than other people do. And those are the folks that we really worry about. And so what causes people to be stressed? Well, the job itself is stressful, but sometimes what makes that job stressful is perhaps people are doing work that they're not really willing to do, but they're forcing themselves to do. So they're very ambivalent about doing the work. I think that makes the caregiving work harder. And then certainly when people don't have enough support, they don't have enough other family members pitching in or enough neighbors doing nice things for them, and perhaps they become socially isolated, then they're more likely to become highly stressed and therefore more prone to the depression and anxiety. And what we find, what I spend a lot of time as a psychologist doing is working with caregivers to elicit, I should say, solicit as much help as they can from others, family members, and their community, and how to ask the questions, how to not say, could you stop by sometime and visit, but saying, can you come by on Thursday afternoon? Because I'll need to run out to see my accountant that day, and I'm hoping you can stay here with my husband and give me a couple hours. Can you do that this Thursday at 3 o'clock? You're asking something very, very specific rather than very, very general. The general asks, people will say, sure, I'll be right there. I'll be there for you whenever you want, and nothing will ever happen. And to your question, Carolyn, the folks, there will be folks that you really think are going to come through who won't, and you're going to be really surprised and embittered about it. People who maybe were lifelong friends who will have failed you, and you're going to really feel betrayed by them, and that's going to hurt your relationships with them. At the same time, there'll be folks that you didn't expect to step up, who are going to surprise you and step up and do things like help with the pill box and take you out to lunch and maybe drive you occasionally if you drive your care receivers to the physical therapy appointment or somewhere else if you really need that. And they're just going to come through, and that's going to be it's going to be so wonderful, and you'll have a bond with that person forever afterwards. And so that's part of this journey, like to how to figure out who's going to be on your team, who's going to be someone you can really rely on. And it's not going to be exactly who you think it is from at the beginning.
Mhm. I found with my clients, I do a lot of grief work, and I found that I want to say particularly with younger people who are grieving, but it could be with older people too. But I do think what you said is like the people you thought were going to show up don't always, but sometimes it's someone who, and I just say younger grievers because they might have like a friend of a friend, but that person also lost a parent. And in that age group, there's just not a lot of people, but that one person all of a sudden is like, I've been there. I know. So sometimes people kind of show up who you're like, oh yeah, that's, but they're that person. So I've noticed the same thing sometimes happens in grief too, right?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when we feel some commonality with people, and they get us, we get them. And especially if it's an experience that it's maybe an off time experience. You're saying that for young people, they may not have a parent who died, or someone else close to them die. That's a more normative experience later in life. But so I lost my dad when I was 15 years old to cancer. I didn't know anybody else my age who had lost a parent. By the time I was probably 25, I knew a few, and because people had other parents who had cancer or had other bad medical outcomes, and those folks that kind of had lost a parent became like this little brotherhood of like we all could kind of got one another, and those who hadn't had that experience just really didn't understand. They might be nice about it, they might ask questions about it, or they might be really uncomfortable about it and avoid bringing up the topic, which is probably more likely. But the folks that had been through it got it, and they were supportive, and they could talk with you about it. So we're talking the same language here.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Um, so you have a section taking care of yourself too. And we did just kind of touch on that, but you defined self-care and I liked your definition of it. Um, do you remember your definition?
Not off the top of my head. That's okay.
I don't know. I'm gonna look it up because
Sure,
I
go right ahead. Thank you.
so this is what I liked about it. Self-care includes any activity you engage in to care for your physical, mental, and or spiritual health and growth. And I love that you kind of defined it: napping, exercise, party going, cooking, eating out. So I thought that was just really helpful too. I think there's a lot of talk nowadays about self-care, and it all depends on what replenishes you when you're feeling depleted. Anyway, I just liked that. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's one tried and true way for everyone to refill the tank. I think we all have our ways, and that's usually the most important thing. Like, the question I always like to ask is like, what do you do for fun? And if people say fun, I haven't had fun in years, and I'll say, what did you do for fun before you became a caregiver? And they'll say, well, I gardened, or I collected stamps, or whatever they said. And then I would say, well, what about doing that now? Like, how do we reincorporate that back in your life? Or if they do it a little bit, say, well, how do we figure out a way to get you to do it more?
Mhm. Great. That's great. That's really you also talked about lack of time, managing and protecting time. That is a new term. I haven't heard that and I loved it. Protecting time. That's great.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest there are two barriers to people caring for themselves. So one is time, and the other is guilt. So setting guilt aside for a second, which is a
Mhm.
whole enormous phenomenon in caregiving unto itself. But caregivers are busy. I mean, especially if they're juggling multiple responsibilities. So maybe they got a full-time job, and then after work, they come and they spend a few hours with a parent who needs help, makes them dinner, does shopping, gets their pillbox in order, tucks them in at night. I mean, it's basically like a job and a half or two jobs. I mean, that's a lot. That person doesn't have a lot of time. And so it's very easy for someone like a doctor or a psychologist to say, why don't you take some time for yourself? Maybe go have lunch with friends, or, maybe you can take a walk. And that caregiver is like, here's that suggestion. And I think you just don't get it. You have no idea what my life is like. So it's much better to have that discussion with a caregiver about what's realistic for them to do. And what I have found has been helpful is if they can identify a day and an hour or 2 hours when it's just their time. And so on Friday evenings from 6 to 8, nobody's going to disturb them. They're going to do what they want to do. And that will be an evening when someone else will be there with their parent, caring for the parent. And maybe that's the night when they have dinner with their spouse, or they go to the gym, or uh, they they like to read. Or I recall one caregiver I worked with years ago who, in her home, she had an extra bedroom which she had turned into an art studio. And one day a week, at a certain hour, she would go into that studio and she would paint for an hour. And everyone else in the household, all her family members, knew that she was not to be disturbed during that hour. That was her protected time. And it was literally protected because the bedroom door would be closed. People were not supposed to come through that door when she was in there with the door closed. So that's what I mean by protected time.
Love it. That's great. That's really great and great tip. So my next question was going to be about guilt, guilt, and you mentioned CBT. Can you spend a minute talking about that? And guilt is huge. It's huge. I know caregiving, when I worked in hospice, and certainly in grief. So it's a good topic for us to talk about.
I mean, people feel guilty that they're never doing enough, or they're not doing it right, or they feel guilty if they make a mistake. And every caregiver makes mistakes. It could be a mistake of giving the wrong pill at the wrong time, or not picking up the pills when they were supposed to, or being late to the doctor's appointment, or not having, the right pieces of equipment, or it's all the things that are part of life. But caregivers don't want to screw up here. They want to really do a perfect job. And a perfect job is not possible because that's not the way life works, and we're all human beings. So people feel guilty that they're not perfect. They feel guilty that their care receiver is suffering, and they can't relieve that suffering the way they would like. And that guilt, unfortunately, means sometimes people feel like they don't deserve to take time for themselves, have protected time, or they don't deserve to feel good about what they're doing. And so guilt is a major issue in caregiving because it actually stops people from caring for themselves, and therefore makes it more difficult for them to sustain themselves over time. And so you mentioned CBT, which stands for cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a form of psychotherapy that looks at the unrealistic expectations that we may have for ourselves. So at any given time, there's a kind of monologue going on in our head. We're talking to ourselves about ourselves. So we're saying, what are you gonna make for lunch today? Or, why didn't you do a better job in that meeting? Why didn't you talk up more? Or like, I can't believe I said that. Oh my Lord, that was such a stupid thing to say. So we're kind of talking about the future. We're talking about the past. We're judging ourselves constantly. And if the way we judge ourselves is too harsh because we've set the bar too high, then we're going to be more prone to not just guilt, but more prone to depression and anxiety. And those expectations that we have for ourselves are often based on very little. They're based on just some assumptions that we have about ourselves, about the kind of perfect job we should do or how we should perform. And most of the time, those expectations can be revised if we look at them more realistically and maybe more rationally. And when we lower the bar to a place where it's more appropriate for it to be placed, then oftentimes we don't feel as much guilt. So if I make a mistake as a caregiver, if I forgot to pick up something, or maybe I even forgot about a doctor's appointment, okay, I'm really stressed. It happens. It's not the end of the world. I'm not perfect. No one's aiming for perfection here. My care receiver is not going to die because of this. We're going to go on, and we need to try to do better tomorrow. That's taking what may be a mistake and trying to use it to motivate you rather than to beat yourself up because of it.
Yeah, no, I love it. This is great. And when you were talking, it reminded me, I did a training just like a couple years ago, and the therapist was talking about how, what you're saying is we have this negative voice often. And it was interesting because she said, for those of you out there, when you become a parent, you get this negative voice, right? But I think there's something about caring for someone else because it's true when you become a caregiver, if you become a caregiver of your parent or your spouse or someone else, there's something about caregiving that really I think really starts to like we kind of judge ourselves or that negative voice really starts to come in. And it just reminded me in the example she gave in the training was like if if you're a mom, dad, whatever, but I think it's the same voice when you're responsible for someone. I think that's what this voice is saying, right?
I think that's exactly right. I think you put your finger on it, because when you're responsible for someone, the stakes are high. And
Mm,
it's not like you have your own doctor's appointment and you showed up late for it, and maybe they don't want to see you that day. You have to reschedule, and that's an annoyance. And maybe you're a little pissed at yourself that you did this, but okay, who gets hurt by it? You get hurt by it. But if you've done this for somebody else and
mhm,
you've been responsible for them, and they're someone who has some sort of illness, and they're not seeing the doctor, could have ramifications. Well, it's a much, much bigger deal, or at least in your mind, it's a much bigger deal. And so it's not it's like a humongous deal that if you make a mistake, that the world is going to fall apart. It just isn't, and you're going to just continue try to do better. And if you're less stressed, you will do better.
mhm. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, great. And working with guilt, I think is a big I would imagine it's something you do a lot in your practice and working with caregivers.
I mean, um, if there wasn't guilt, then I'm afraid I wouldn't have a practice, right?
I
Guilt causes a lot of human misery, unfortunately. And it drives a lot of therapy practices as a result.
Yeah, it's human nature. Yeah. So you also talked about in this same section mindfulness techniques. I am very into meditation and mindfulness, and you did talk about Tai Chi. And I wanted to share, I took my first Qigong class a couple months ago, and it was really hard. But it was neat. It was neat. So if you want to expand on some of these things.
And I mean, we're not going to do justice to mindfulness here today, but I'll just say that mindfulness is just another tool. It's just a way for people to get themselves in a more relaxed frame of mind, to help them be less reactive to some of the things that go on. And there are lots of different practices that people employ to achieve that non-reactivity. Qigong, Tai Chi, meditation, yoga, breathing exercises. Um, so there's no one path to this kind of state, more relaxed state of mind. There are many paths, and there's a lot of incorporation of mindfulness into therapy practice now as a way of helping people manage their anxiety, and just try to be more present, less focused on what's going to happen and worrying about that, which we call anxiety, less regretful about what's happened in the past, which we call depression, but just being as present and as intentional about what we're doing as possible.
Yeah. And I love it. And again, I totally agree. And I think those are all really, really helpful. So you also talked about making positive meanings. And again, this is also something we do in grief. My listeners know I do a lot with Dr. Robert Niemeyer's research, and he really talks about meaning making. He does grief, but certainly at end of life. So I think this is a really important, piece of it, meaning making, and finding meaning, right?
Absolutely. I mean, when we feel like we're doing something that has a really positive purpose.
Mhm.
For instance, if I mentioned earlier, if you have a parent who took really good care of you, and now caregiving is an opportunity for you to give back to them, that's very gratifying. That's probably the number one positive meaning I hear people making of caregiving. I also hear people who have a very strong moral sense that this is the right thing to do, or a strong religious sense that they're doing God's work in this world. So those are all positive meanings that enable caregivers to derive greater gratification from caregiving and helps them sustain themselves over this course. If people feel negatively, they're deriving negative meanings of caregiving. For instance, I feel trapped. I feel like I'm being punished. I feel like my family is torturing me by making me do this. Those aren't good ways to sustain yourself as a caregiver. That caregiver is going to have a much tougher time uh, providing the care that may be necessary over time.
Yeah, yeah. So let's move into the next section, communicating with dignity. And this is a big word. I know we use it a lot. It's an important word. You talk about the value of dignity, which I thought was, of course, really important. And then there was a quote, but I didn't know if you want to just expand on that first, the value of dignity or the definition of dignity, before we go into a case study.
I mean, I would just say, I think we all have a pretty good idea of what dignity is. It's being feeling that you're treating yourself or you're being treated by others and you're treating them with respect, with seeing their inherent value and worth, and just the way we speak to them, the way we act with them, feeling that they provide us with dignity, we provide them with dignity, and that is so crucial in family caregiving, oftentimes because the care receiver is feeling disempowered, and they're feeling like because of their illness or their condition that they've lost a lot of their sense of identity and their dignity, and so caregivers have to make a concerted effort to ensure that we're not disrespecting them in addition and adding insult to the injury of the illness that they're experiencing. And by the same token, if the caregiver is not treated in a dignified way by the care receiver, that doesn't work very well either.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the kind of little case studies you had in there. And so I just want to read this woman said, "My aunt doesn't show me much dignity. She's demanding and critical, though I'm working hard to help her and respect her." I'm actually supporting a caregiver right now in my private practice who's feeling the same way. And you had some bullet points in there, but yeah, please give us some counsel on that.
I mean, first thing in order to try to take the sting of this away, is to try to understand the ant's position in the case study. So I've already mentioned that when people are on the receiving end of care, they often feel disempowered. They often feel like they're losing themselves. And one way that so they're unhappy. And I really do, there's a lot of scientific evidence to demonstrate the validity of the term misery loves company. Miserable people often make other people around them feel miserable. And I think miserable care receivers will make caregivers feel miserable unless they're really careful. And so we understand that the ant is hurting. We also understand that one way that people try to maintain some semblance of themselves is by exerting control in any way they can over their lives. And if that means that they're telling the caregiver what to do all the time and trying to control the caregiver or critiquing what the caregiver is doing, then maybe the care receiver is saving face in some way. But it's very tough for the caregiver who is bending over backwards, and here this person is telling them they're not bending far enough, or they're not bending well enough, or they should have done all this yesterday. And it makes caregivers very angry that they're making sacrifices, and those sacrifices are not being appreciated at all.
It's hard. It's really hard. Um, let's talk about you in this same section you talk about another case study. If I'm allowed to sit in on my adult son's meeting with his provider, what should I do before, during, and after? And in that same section.
So we're talking about dignity, and we have to make sure that we're not in any way stepping on the toes of our care receiver in their medical appointment, and that because that would be violating their sense of dignity. This is their medical appointment, Yet we also want to have the opportunity to share some of what we know about what's going on, and also we want to ask questions. And so what works best is if the caregiver and care receiver work all this out beforehand. That this doesn't just get improvised in the doctor's office, but they say, well, thank you for letting me sit in on your appointment. Um, there are a few things I'm hoping to ask the doctor. I want to make sure that's okay with you. And there are a few things I'm hoping to bring up. I hope that's okay with you. And let's actually, maybe we can kind of write an agenda for what we want to get out of this appointment. Because if the doctor, the doctor will have his or her ideas of what to accomplish during this 10 or 15-minute visit. But if we have an agenda, then and we even share that agenda with the doctor at the beginning of the visit, then maybe we can accomplish more, and then afterwards we can go over things and we'll feel like we were aligned, and we both got out of the visit what we hoped to. So that conversation, that planning, shows, first of all, does lead to more satisfying medical visits, but it also leads to a little bit better mutual respect between that caregiver and care receiver, because they've kind of talked about what is important to each of them, and how do they want to best use that 10 or 15-minute session. And then if need be, they have to negotiate some of that, but then they work on that together. And if they are able to accomplish that, they leave with a feeling like we work pretty well together as a team.
Hmm. I think what everything you're saying is so important because I think like life happens, we have the relationship, things start to change, and you're really able to give a lens to things to kind of have some clarity. And I think that this is just such an important tool for a lot of caregivers to say, to have your kind of perspective of like, oh yeah, I can kind of have this clarity or have this conversation, or how can I kind of have an understanding of the situation. I hope that that was articulate.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what you say is right. I mean, what it comes down to is caregiving. What's key about caregiving is the relationship. Is there are many tasks that have to get done, but just completing tasks is not the point of caregiving. It's about giving care, and giving care to support someone to live as well as they can, given whatever their condition is. And that means we have to be in relationship with them. And just as with any other relationship, we have to know this person. We have to be sensitive to who they are at any given time. We have to share, have to communicate well with them. And we have to comfort them, and have, hopefully they will show us the same consideration in their relationship with us. And when a caregiver and care receiver really work together, it strengthens their bond also. I have talked to so many caregivers who say we're caring for a parent, and maybe they didn't have a wonderful relationship with that parent previously, but in working together through this phase of their care receiver's life, they forge a stronger bond, a better understanding, and more love than they've ever had. And that too is part of the positive reward of caregiving, right? Where those relationships can be improved.
That's amazing. Wow. Wow. Okay, you're doing some really amazing work here. Um,
Well, thank you.
Well, because you had one section, and I'm not, I am being mindful of the time, but it is true. You have a case study in here. I forget where, but it reminded me of when I worked in hospice. Worked with a woman, and her father had been very abusive to the mom. And her brother said to her, as sometimes happens, boys, when they get bigger and stronger, they'll try to stand up for their mom, right? So he would try to, as he got older, he would, try to protect mom. He got big and tall and took some of the punches from dad, right? And the daughter just didn't, but she knew her dad was very abusive. Anyway, she said to me, I'm doing this all alone. My brother called me up and he said, our dad is a blankety blank, blank, blank. You can do what you want. I'm not judging you. Call me when he's dead. And she understood his point of view, and she was alone, but it was really, she did take care of him. She really did. But it was very hard to wrestle with, knowing how he had really abused their mom, right? Anyway, so I just wanted, and I know you have a case study very similar in the book.
Yeah, I mean, that's those cases are awful, but they're real. I mean, that happens. And um, And I've seen cases where like that, where families will say, we're not going to take care of this guy, and we're shipping him off somewhere else as quickly as we can. I've seen other folks in families such as that say, well, and maybe the sister felt this way, that I'm going to do this because it's the right thing to do, and because I feel like my dad is now not the person he was when he was a violent terror, and now he's a broken down person and who's hurting, and it's just a kind thing to do to step up and help someone who's hurting. Um, and then I will have also seen situations like that where the sister will be furious with the brother and will say to the brother, I understand how you feel about dad, but do you realize that in the process you're abandoning me,
Mhm.
and that this is going to hurt our relationship? And sometimes the brothers in that situation will say, well, that's too bad. I can't stand the sight of that guy, and I'm not going to do anything for him. And if you want to step in and help him, that's on you, but I'm not going to help you. And that not only will eventually they'll lose their father, but that those siblings will sometimes lose each other in the course of the decisions they're making about caregiving.
And you do talk about that in the book, and it's true. Family dynamics can be very affected and very changed, and you give a lot of case studies of how that affects families, and same with grief too after. But you're right, this the family dynamics and all the different feelings that people have, and I love how you give a lot of different case studies in the book and a lot of different examples. It's really helpful.
I really appreciate hearing that, and I mean families are complicated,
Mhm.
and when dealing with adversity, and caregiving for many families is adversity, it can bring out the best in people, it can bring out the worst in people, and we want to hopefully bring out the best because that's what strengthens families. What I always say to folks at the end is at the end of the day, I want your family to be stronger for having gone through this, not weaker. And I've seen so many times, including in my own family growing up, where caregiving um, weakened the family, and so afterwards, the family relationships were more distant and more suffused with anger, unfortunately. But when family members are able to pull together, work out their issues to the point that they can actually talk to one another, communicate, treat each other with dignity, and have and feel good about this, derive positive meanings from it that they can share. Those family relationships are improved. That could occur. Better relationships between siblings, better relationships between husbands and wives. I mean, if they've pitched in to help with one of their parents. I mean, there's lots of ways that caregiving can teach people lessons and improve their relationships.
Mhm. Well, thank you. Thank you. Can we do one quick last case study before we wrap up here?
Sure.
You're a wealth of knowledge. So I know that there's a number of people, and I'm even going to say friends of mine or people my age, and sometimes a little younger, who are kind of frustrated, like my parents aren't doing the will, or they didn't do this, or they're not putting things in place, or and I do wonder if there's a little bit of a generational difference. But then sometimes this younger generation is, it's all going to fall on me. If they don't do it, what am I going to do? And then it is guilt and fear for the younger generation, but then it's like they want the parents to do it, and the parents aren't doing it. So then there's some conflict. I don't know. Do you see this at all? I see it. Maybe it's just a lot, like I said, with my generation or people I know. But then I think there's guilt for the younger person. Like I said, what am I going to do? How am I going to take care of them? They don't want to have the conversation. So it's a conflict around that.
I mean, that's unfortunately not unusual, and do talk about it in the book. Um, it certainly it sounds good to have these conversations beforehand, but many people don't want to have a conversation. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to plan for bad things happening because they have this magical belief that if you plan for them, you'll make them more likely to happen. And so there's a lot of resistance. And sometimes an adult child just has to say to their parent, you don't want to do this for you. You don't want to fill out an advance directive, a living will. You don't want to fill out a last will and testament. That's, you have that those are things you may feel strongly. I'm asking you to do this for me.
Mm.
Please, if you do these, fill out these legal documents, it'll make it easier for me and my siblings. Because if you something should happen, you should die, then it'll be much harder for us if we don't have that your guidance as to how to handle your affairs. And some parents will, the first thing a parent will say in that instance is like, nothing's bad's going to happen. I'm not going to die. Well, guess what? That everyone dies, and everyone has to plan for these things. So I'm very much of the belief that adult children can say, "I need this from you," and
Mm.
the parent should take heed of that. It's not often that a child will say, "I absolutely need this from you. This is really important." Parents should sit up and really pay attention to that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And I do love that. I think that's really, really helpful. Um, so thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. You're like a wealth of knowledge. And this is the book, the AARP Caregiver Answer Book, Barry J. Jacobs. And you wrote it with your wife, Julia, who I think also has a podcast too, maybe.
Yeah, she has had a podcast on psychology and social justice. So, but thank you, and really appreciate the time, Carolyn. Appreciate the opportunity, and you know, thank you for the work that you're doing too.
Yeah, so like, oh, one thing before we go, I just want to say really quickly, the other thing, so this book, as I mentioned, throughout, you've got some practical information as well. You cover a lot of different things, social, emotional, economic, practical, and you also have a nice resource list at the end, helpful organizations and websites, which I really love. That's also at the very end. And as we said throughout, you've got some information on some trainings and those kinds of things. So I did want to just say, I love the whole book. I love your case studies. I think that's really helpful. And at the end, there's some helpful resources as well. So that's, that can also help people too. So really great. So thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today.
And thanks to all our listeners and everybody watching. This has been a wonderful, informative podcast. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you.